want to go through a little bit of the context historically and culturally of where did this play Antigone come from. And now we know it was written by Sophocles, almost certainly, at around the year 440 or so, but what was going on to lead to this, and what were the values that came out of that time? And now, first thing is, let me set the context of it and get out of here for a little bit. And what you'll notice is, number one, that is a dinosaur, but we're going to put Antigone within its classical context, okay? And by classical, I know how people think. They just think ancient, long, the Greeks, wait. There's actually a succession of periods that's important to keep in mind that really plays out. And let's go through it. And really what I'm going to do is break it into 3 different ages. There are essentially 3 different ages that you need to know about beforehand. And you're probably somewhat, you know a bit about it, but you didn't know they were broken down into 3. The first one I'm going to talk about is a little bit about ancient Greece. Now, this is one you are only vaguely aware of, but in a way that you're not quite sure that you are. It's ancient Greece from around 3200 BCE to 1200 BCE. Now, that's a broad range, a very broad range. The other period I'm going to go into is what I'm going to call the archaic period, and that's from around 1200 to 700. And I'll give you a bit of a heads up. You know very little about that period, but you've heard a few things, okay? The last period I'm going to go into is classical. That is the period you've heard a good deal about, and you know a lot of the names from that time period, okay? Let's first take a look at the ancient period for a moment. Now, the ancient period is essentially what's you may have heard of it referred to as the Bronze Age. Now, I am putting, if you look at the numbers and do the math, that is essentially a 2,000-year period. If you go all the way back in history from today's period, you would have to run all the way back to the time of Jesus of Nazareth. That's how long of a period we're talking about here. Ancient Greece really was the Bronze Age, and it includes periods such as the Sumerians and others. And you are getting very different regions and very different civilizations cropping up at this time. But what we're dealing with primarily are the groups around the Mediterranean. And now you have this little map here. And this little map is pretty important because it shows what was going on essentially at the time. This is the Mediterranean. This is Greece up here in the left-hand corner. Over on the right hand is what's called the Levant. This would be modern-day Israel, and even over here is Iraq and other regions. And down here is Egypt. At the northern part of the Mediterranean, that is what today is known as Turkey. This was essentially a region where there was an enormous amount of trade going on. Now, in the southern part is Egypt, and that was the largest empire, by far the largest civilization, and it was the biggest player in the region. But in the middle of Turkey was a region called, or was an empire called the Hittites, and you may have heard about them. You may not have. They were a very powerful, and they were up in Hittite. They were a powerful kingdom, and they were one of the only landlocked kingdoms that there was at the time. And they did have a very clever way of holding onto their water and getting through times. But also over on the left side, you'll see the island, and it's marked as Knossos. And up above it is Mycenae and Pylos. Those were essentially the Greek civilizations at this time. And they're Greek in that they are located in Greece. They did not speak, as far as we know, really what would become the ancient Greek language. So this is the time period where there was an enormous amount of trade amongst these civilizations. We know this because they wrote about it a little bit. We have some of their writings, Linear A and Linear B, and we have some of the correspondence between them. We also have some of their shipwrecks and some of their ruins from the time period. And so really the Mediterranean was not a barrier, and you should not think of the Mediterranean as a barrier at all between Europe and North Africa. It was really a freeway system. And again, I need to make that clear. It was really a freeway system for trade. So you had the Hittites in the north, the Greeks in the west, and the Egyptians in the south. And essentially, you had, throughout the Levant, you had Kadesh and others. You had that region in the middle was the Levant, where Israel is today. That was where the Hittites and the Egyptians often got into wars. But overall, they spent most of their time trading with each other. And you had an enormously developed level of civilization amongst the groups. And you would see most students are aware of what we have left from Egypt. You know, these kind of massive architectural sculptures and other things. Is horrendously just, again, it was the most advanced civilization of the time. They were essentially the big civilization in that region at the time. But you also had these other regions, and this was Mycenae in Greece. This was found in the late 19th century, by Schliemann, was one of the archaeologists who found it. He was really more of a businessman who set about setting up an archaeological dig. And he found, and you can see, this is a magnificent palace structure. It did not have different levels to it. Apparently it was only 2 levels high. It wasn't too high. It wasn't, you don't want to think about castles. You really want to think about palaces, because as far as we can tell, they weren't built very high. But they were magnificent. This is the famous Lion's Gate at Mycenae, and you can see this was one heck of a civilization to have constructed this. This is still in existence. So that was the ancient Greek period, and they were enormously accomplished, but they did not have as advanced of a writing system, and they did not have a literature that we're aware of that really got handed down heavily and influenced the other cultures. In the next period, that's the archaic period. That is the period after 1200. There is essentially no writing. The palaces are essentially being occupied by the people who are left over. You don't have large civilizations. They're not writing about things. Basically, it disappeared. We're not exactly sure what happened. It seems a series of things happened to wipe out this advanced orchestration of civilizations that was going on during the Bronze Age. It seems that they had a drought that hit them, but they also seem to have suffered what's called an earthquake storm that knocked down many of their sculptures and many of their palaces and many of their cities. And then they had a period when a group called the Sea People. This is a group written about by the Egyptians. They did not know exactly where they were from, but they came from the sea. We think they may have came from Sardinia around Italy. Maybe. They might have come from that area. They started to raid the area. Now, one of the things that we're not certain of is, did they cause the final collapse, or did they take advantage of the collapse that was already going on? So in other words, did they just fill a power vacuum, or did the Sea Peoples actually cause it? It seems more likely that they probably filled a power vacuum that was created. But one of the things to note is that instead of these great palaces, we have these kind of artworks, which are terracotta things from that time period. This is around from 900 BCE. This is far less sophisticated than what we were seeing in the Bronze Age. Civilization had undergone quite a collapse. Okay, now these people, we don't have any writing from this time period at all. We do have people like this, and you've heard of Homer, and the Iliad and the Odyssey. They understood that the golden age, or the age of heroes, the people who had come before them, it was gone. And so people like Homer, if he did exist as a human being, There's some doubt about it, whether or not he existed as a human being. He did not write. And if you know about the Iliad and the Odyssey, which are ascribed to him, these are enormous works. They're about 800 pages apiece, and they're extraordinarily detailed. These would have been composed orally. So in oral compositions, if they were rhymed, they could be held on to. They would memorize the poems, which you can do. If somebody asked you the lyrics of a song that you last heard in junior high school, let alone 6th grade or 4th grade, you could probably remember a number of them. You could probably remember the lyrics in a great deal of detail, if not exactly. That's what poetry did. It enabled people to memorize poems in a form that was set. And so Homer was a poet, and he would hold on to poems if he was a single person, and they would compose it in a poetic form that could be passed down from generation to generation, and it could be performed again from town to town to town. But what they composed their poetry about was the golden age that had passed. They knew that the golden age was gone. They saw the palaces. They were sometimes squatting in the palaces and living in them, the ruins of previous generations. They figured this must have been an age of great people, heroes who did great things. The Iliad and the Odyssey are the stories of Homer that were composed at his time period during the archaic period, about a period that came before them, where they imagined that this period must have been filled with great people who did great things. Troy almost certainly existed. And let me go back to that map and I'll show you where it existed. It was, and this is again the Mediterranean. And over here you're seeing Greece. Homer would have been in this region, and Troy would have been up here. And notice from this map is actually quite useful because it shows the migrations of different people in here. And mostly they brought a lot of destruction. And Troy had been destroyed a number of times previously and had always been rebuilt. What happened in around 1200 is it was destroyed for the final time. It was not rebuilt. Again, notice it's near the sea because it was apparently, as far as we know, a major trading center. And it was located in such in a location that allowed it access to the Greeks, to the Egyptians and others. And they had other cities that were built around this Mediterranean that engaged in the trade. And so the ancient Troy, the Trojan War that you hear of in the Iliad and that you know of from the stories, hopefully not that movie that Brad Pitt was in because that was really awful. But anyway, those stories were built around this, and Troy was destroyed around 1200. Homer would have heard stories about it around 800, around 900 or so, and composed the stories about it and handed those down. So the archaic period came in between. The ancient period ended around 1200, and that's when the archaic period began, and they knew they were a fallen age. Much of the mythology that you know of came from another man named Hesiod, and again, this sculpture was from the classical time period. And Hesiod, we have no images of him directly from his time period or sculptures. He composed a lot of the mythology that you're aware of, like the stories of how Zeus came to power, and Aphrodite and other things, and Athena and Apollo and the others. Hesiod composed those. Homer composed the ones about the Trojan War and others. So much of the religion and the mythology that was composed during the archaic period, and it was composed orally. Poets did not write. They composed their poems orally, and they handed them down in a poetic format so that they could be recited again. Now, by the time we get to the classical period, things have changed. Things have changed dramatically. This is the time period you're aware of in one form or another. If you know any names, you almost certainly know names from this time period. You may have heard of Socrates. he was from this time period. He was around 470 to 400. And yes, he did exist. He did not actually write anything, though. He taught somebody you also heard of. He taught Plato, who did exist. He wrote an enormous amount, and he wrote it down in a physical format that's been handed down. And it was so influential that we have multiple copies of it, and we have other people talking about Plato. And we have Aristotle, who was a student of Plato's. Plato actually taught Aristotle, whom you have almost certainly heard of. And Aristotle taught Alexander the Great. So this was the classical time period. And you know of things because they achieved magnificent sculptures in their time period and had a magnificent civilization. And again, this was in Greece. Egypt did survive that downturn, but it was really in a not such a glorious time period for them. Greece collapsed and then came back and made temples like this. This is one of their temples for Athena. So, and here's another, the Parthenon. These sculptures you've seen, or these buildings you've seen, these were constructed during the classical period, and they were used and occupied during that time period. Now, Sophocles existed or lived during this time period. And here he is right here. And from around 496 to 400, and you can do the math, he lived over 90 years. Once again, he lived over 90 years. He served in the military, and he was extraordinarily well known in his time period. He was essentially an extraordinarily famous general in the military, but also a very famous playwright. He's best known today for the production of Oedipus Rex. You've almost certainly heard of that play in one form or another. That is, I think, without a doubt, the most influential play ever composed or ever presented. I don't think there would be much debate over that within theater circles. But Antigone is the daughter of Oedipus. Now, mind you, he would be working with a mythology that was created before he was born. He's working with the mythology that was created during the archaic period. So Oedipus would have been known as a hero from the archaic period. The archaic period was when his story was composed about his story that was thought to have existed during the ancient period. So it's very important to keep those three ages in mind. So Sophocles is working with a Greek mythology that was composed during the archaic period. And it was a mythology created about what was the ancient period. People making up stories about the age that came before them. We still do this to a degree today. If you think about the stories that exist about George Washington and chopping down the cherry tree, which, by the way, we have absolutely no verification of, that is almost certainly a story that's made up. But you know that story because it's handed down about a time period that's 200 years ago. And you know how powerful that story is because it gets handed off for generation after generation. And that story about chopping down the cherry tree tells us a story about George Washington that we want to believe, that even as a child, he was honest about things he would get in trouble for. He was just devoted to honesty. That's what we want to believe about George Washington. Again, there's no confirmation of it. So those stories and those mythologies in the Greek time period were handed down, and they showed the value system of the classical Greeks. So the value system of the classical Greeks is in the stories they latched onto from the archaic period. The archaic period composed the stories they believed about the ancient period. Okay? So he was very well known in Athens, and he was a rival of Aeschylus and Euripides. You do know a little bit about them. They composed a number of plays. You've probably heard a little bit of them. And what you can see on the right-hand side are two theaters as they still exist today. This is where his plays would have been performed. This was not some little podunk theater. This was an extremely well-developed amphitheater. So, and this is the classical time period. And you can see they were building a two-story theater. theater, not a building for government or other things like the Parthenon or something else, but this is for entertainment. This is another picture of one of the theaters that existed, and these aren't all in Athens. And you can see the scale of these theaters. And mind you, these people here could be heard by people up in the upper decks. The acoustics were that good. I know that because my daughter went there, and she heard somebody talking on the stage here, and she was standing up at the top, and the acoustics were so good she could hear them just having a conversation on the stage. Okay, so that's how good the acoustics were, and how good the ancient Athenians were, ancient Greeks were, at constructing those theaters. And again, I do want to point out this less than curious fact. This is from when my daughter went to Greece, and she stood at the top of that one theater and could hear people talking on the stage. I mention that because it's very important to keep in mind how advanced these ancient Greeks were. They were extraordinarily advanced. And you're going to get that subtlety in the mind of the Greeks, in the value system, in the play itself. Again, think of how important that George Washington story is to us, because we want to believe that George Washington just couldn't tell a lie. And you're going to get through Antigone many of the values of the classical Greeks. And those are values based in the stories of the archaic period, but these stories were composed about the ancient period that came before. Okay, that's the context of it. I hope that makes sense. Jump into the play, and you're going to learn a good deal about them, and you're going to see that there's something that we can identify with even 2,000 years later. Take care.